Hey guys, hope you all are doing well. As you can see from the title and thumbnail, we are going to start a new What If. So let's start chapter 1. Rias was acutely aware of the tendril of guilt, worming itself into her heart as she watched the poor perverted boy, walking around with his date. His face was alight with excitement, contrasting with Ria's expression. Not surprising, as he didn't know his date was a supernatural being in disguise, or that she was leading him deeper into the park just to have a more convenient spot for his assassination. Rias was burning with a desire to erase that arrogant fallen angel from the face of the earth. The sheer gall she had, thinking that she could just stroll in the middle of her territory and assassinate a sacred gear holder, one Rias had marked as a future member of her peerage. Power of destruction was crackling on her fingertips, begging to be unleashed. Normally, Rias wouldn't have waited a second before lashing out, burning that arrogant crow into cinders, but the circumstances held her hand. She was desperate. Desperate enough to allow the assassination of an innocent boy for her own benefit. If only she didn't have that damnable betrothal hanging on her head, threatening to bound her to a pathetic man for eternity. It wasn't that she would be happy with the idea of an arranged marriage even if her betrothed was a nice man. The idea of being married just for politics was anathema to her romantic perception. But the fact that her betrothed was a pig brought her situation to a point of desperation. She was willing to do almost everything to get free of her engagement. She had no intention of living the rest of her life as a spineless man's conquest. But canceling her betrothal was no simple issue. Without her family's support, her options were limited. Her parents were the biggest supporter of the marriage, and while her brother was against it, ironically, his position as the strongest devil prevented him from weighing in an inter-family matter without raising the question of favoritism. There were some political ploys she had employed, and small victories she accumulated, but she had no illusion about how it would end. A rating game, a naked contest of power and strategy between her and her betrothed. And unfortunately, that was the biggest problem. He might be a pathetic man in terms of personality, but Riser Phoenix was the rising star of the rating games. With his full peerage, he had managed to accumulate a string of victories in the short time he had joined the competition. He had just 2 losses in more than a dozen battles he had been through, and even those 2 were more of a thorn on her side rather than beacons of hope. Riser had forfeited those 2 for political favors. Favors that he had no complication employing against her, destroying most of the political capital Rias managed to accumulate. While neither Riser nor her family could object to a rating game as the final arbiter, that would be only comforting if Rias had a reasonable chance for victory. And, as much as it hurt her pride to admit, in her current state, her chances against him was practically nil. She had the vaunted power of destruction, but she wasn't her brother. She couldn't single-handedly win against a full peerage. She didn't even know whether she could win against Riser himself in a fair match-up, with his regeneration ability perfectly countering hers. Her peerage was not ready for such a battle despite their powerful abilities and their unparalleled loyalty. She only had 4 pieces compared to Riser's 15, and to make things even worse, her bishop was still unable to control his power, making her situation even worse. No matter how unique her peerage members were, they wouldn't be able to stand against the opposition. The solution was simple. She needed to recruit. But simple wasn't the same as easy. The most logical front of recruitment, the underground, was effectively barred for her, with Riser using his family's considerable political power and his status as a rising star to hamper her recruitment effort. Her family was stronger than Riser's, but that meant nothing when her parents were actively supporting the marriage, and happy with Riser's attempts. Her only option was to recruit from the human world. Normally, that would be an amazing opportunity, as she was fascinated by the human world and their incredible ability for growth. Some humans were strong enough to win against the devils even without any extraordinary enhancements. With the boost they would receive from the evil pieces, they could be the key for her victory. But once again, Rias was restricted, this time by the strict conditions for her presence on Earth. She was not allowed to step outside Kuo, significantly limiting her pool of candidates. Some of the citizens had amazing potential, as Sona proved with her own peerage, collected from students with no previous combat experience, but showing amazing progress. Rias was sure that, with the growth they were showing, Sona's peerage was going to be a deadly force in the arena in a decade or 2. Nothing more than a blink. But Rias didn't have a decade. She wasn't sure whether she even had a year, with both her family and Riser trying to push the fated day even closer. Expanding her peerage was her biggest priority, enough to make her betray her principles, making her watch helplessly as a student under her protection was about to be assassinated. His unknown but potentially powerful sacred gear should have been immaterial, but this time, fear for her future managed to beat her principles. She let it happen because she couldn't risk him rejecting her offer, no matter how small the chances. But if he was already dead, he had no choice, and Rias could swoop in as the savior. But all that reasoning didn't make it any easier to watch as the fallen angel stabbed him while laughing mercilessly, stretching his death for the sole purpose of insulting him. It was a struggle for her to keep control, not just stepping forward to erase that smug bitch from the face of the earth. Only after the fallen angel had disappeared, Rias started walking towards the bloodied body that was lying on the ground, struggling to breathe. Rias hadn't wasted any time before conjuring her pawns, knowing it would be harder to resurrect him if he was actually dead. She placed a pawn on his body and then reached to her power, focused through her king piece, trying to activate the ritual. It didn't work, not that Rias was surprised about it. She still didn't know which sacred gear he was holding, but it was strong enough to be noticed even its sealed state. One pawn would never be enough to turn him into a devil unless it was her brother that was resurrecting. She quickly added several more until 5 pawns were resting on his chest, repeating the trigger, but no reaction. She placed the 6th one, her heart beating in excitement. There were very few sacred gears that would resist resurrection by her 6 pawns, especially the holder was just a boy with no training and no magical potential. She added the 7th. Still no reaction. She could feel her palms getting sweaty, with fear joining her excitement as she reached for her last pawn. The doubt assaulted her mind. Maybe she wasn't strong enough. Maybe she deserved to be sold into a marriage like a cattle. When she placed the 8th pawn, it was the confirmation of all of her fears. They stayed inert, failing to react, no matter how many times she tried to trigger the ritual. Rias closed her eyes, trying to stand on her feet in the rush of a sudden vertigo, tears pricking her eyes. She just complicity allowed a student under her protection to be murdered, and it was turned out to be nothing. She was too weak to resurrect him. Maybe it was a divine punishment, nothing less than she deserved. With her eyes closed, she hadn't seen how, but she was distracted by a sudden rush of energy, like a point-blank shout to her magical senses. Her eyes popped open, only to see her pawns burning bright with a deep crimson light, brighter than any other piece Rias had seen. Why? She didn't know. Maybe it was some kind of weird result of using all 8 pawns, or maybe it was her desperation unlocking their full capability. But Rias didn't care about the reason. All that mattered was her pawns disappearing into his body, transforming his flesh to supernatural kind. Rias didn't waste any time before creating a teleportation circle, carrying the poor boy to his own bed, giving him the opportunity for a comfortable rest. One more spell, and he was changed into his pajamas, his blood cleaned. Rias let him sleep, wanting to give him a couple of days to adapt before talking with him about the changes in his life. It would also give the pieces the opportunity to settle into his body. While she teleported to her room, her mind was already busy about how to greet him. He was a famous pervert. Maybe she should step out of the shower to greet him. He certainly deserved a treat like that, after the choice she had forced on him. And tantalizing the idea of sexual reward would no doubt incentives a famous pervert like him. Distracted with her plans, she failed to notice that Issei Hayadu lay with his eyes open, watching her disappear with an amused smirk on his lips. And that's another stage of the plan, completed without a hitch, partner, Issei thought as he watched the red-haired beauty disappear in a rush of crimson light. Despite his desires, he was limiting himself to watch the sway of the spectacular hips that was in front of him. Meanwhile, an alien sensation was spreading to his body, transforming it irrevocably. A plan that I hate. Rose the voice of an ancient dragon rose from Issei's soul. Or more accurately, from a container right next to his soul, where it was imprisoned. An inescapable prison called sacred gear. We shouldn't be bothering with all those subterfuge. We are the secure UT. Nothing can stand against us. We should, really, even Ophis, said Issei, cutting Deedrake's tirade halfway. We have talked about it hundreds of times, buddy. No matter how hard I work, the limitations of a human body are too hard to suppress. Even against the Albion's wielder, I'm not willing to bet on my chances before a decade of training, and I'm known for betting on some really long shots. Not if you use the Juggernaut drive, Diedrag tried to say, only for Issei to cut him halfway. And like I said before, I have no intention of sacrificing my life just that you can win another point in your eternal grudge match. Like we agreed before, I will make sure to make us strong enough to stand against those threats, but you need to ignore your blind pride for a few months. If only we had time. With all the inventive methods you have developed, it wouldn't take long before your own power was enough to beat that brat carrying Albion's pathetic leeching power. Issei sighed tiredly. I would have preferred that as well, but we simply don't have time. Chaos Brigade starting to act out, they will find us sooner or later. And I'm not willing to take my chances against that asshole Cao Cao again without stacking the deck. The first time was enough. And even if could somehow win against him, there is still Ophis to consider. No, integrating ourselves to one of the major factions is our best bet. Devil's body will give me the edge I need, while the name Grimoire would be enough to shield me until I'm strong enough. After all, dear Lucifer would never allow harm coming on his precious sister. Enough talk. I'm bored, Diedrag said before cutting off the connection, but Issei smirked, knowing that his partner was too distracted by modifying transformation activities going on his body to continue talking. He could feel the foreign energies in his body multiplying again and again, accelerating the maturity of his devil form by decades. The energy provided by the pawn's supposed to be just an anchor for the energies a low-class devil would collect through contracts. But the boosted gear was not a simple toy, allowing him to bypass all those steps instead. Still, it was just pure luck that the plan worked. Issei had expected Rias to be strong enough to convert him into the devil, and when it failed, he had to rely on his boosting ability to make up the difference, an untested plan with a significant possibility of failure. He wouldn't die, of course, as he could have easily used his powers to boost his regenerative capabilities instead, but it would still ruin the plan. If Grimoire would have witnessed him curing himself, it would have blown the cover he had been using for the last year. After all, it would be difficult to explain to Rias why the pathetic pervert of the school was suddenly able to use his sacred gear for a delicate healing operation. He shrugged as he threw himself into his bed. It all worked well, and there was no need to worry anymore. Sleep would be nice. Tomorrow, he had a lot of things to do. As he left the school after a full day of class, Issei could feel the marvelous increase of strength in his body. But somehow, it wasn't enough to prevent him from feeling annoyed. The reason, a small, but obviously magical, bat following him. He suppressed his desire to squash it with a blast of energy, no matter how annoying was its presence, preventing him from testing his new abilities. It carried the magical signature of Rias, his new king. He didn't want to start the relationship by killing a familiar of hers. The logic of his inaction wasn't enough to cure his annoyance. Even casting a small obstruction spell to get away was not an option, as it would reveal not only he knew that he was being followed, but was also he was magically competent enough to cast a spell. And that would ruin his cover story. A pointless risk at this stage. But soon, he felt another signature of energy closing to his location, an unappetizing mixture of light and darkness. A male fallen angel, he realized, his hand itching to punch through its chest. He had a little grudge for their kind he needed to detach, and his gender made it even more convenient. He never liked hurting females, especially sexy ones like the one responsible for his bogus assassination. He would still punish her for her daring, of course, but he had more inventive ways for that. The fallen angel's presence was convenient. He could easily ensure the familiar meeting its end in stray fire. Fallen angels were not the most conservative when it came to throwing their toy flashlights around. He changed his direction towards the fallen angel, trying to continue his role until he started throwing his spears around. But his annoyance jumped up to a new level when the fallen angel, instead of trying to kill him, launched a rather lengthy monologue about his supposed superiority, and just in how many ways Issei resembled a cockroach. Issei wanted nothing more than to use rusty needles to teach the arrogant asshole the error of his ways. No matter was, he was a dragon in his soul, and had a low threshold against insults, but the presence of the familiar bound his hand. Then, a flare of teleportation magic popped in his senses, ruining the opportunity completely. Only then, the fallen angel attacked Issei, realizing he had lost his opportunity. Fucking lazy vulture. Issei murmured, trying to make it convincing as he tried to jump away from the light spear, only to fail. With Rias present, retaliating, or even dodging well, was not an option. He lay on the ground in a fake display of agony while Rias and the fallen angel had a heated argument. The spear hurt more than it did the day before, his new devil body not playing well with its weakness to the light element, but still, it was little more than a momentary distraction. He ignored Diedrag's shouts of annoyance, demanding him to rip the wings of the fallen angel for his insolence. It was hard to resist since it was the exact thing Issei wanted. Thankfully, the fallen angel chose to retreat rather than to battle. A wise choice on the surface, as Rias was the stronger of the pair. Not so much in reality, as it gave Issei the opportunity to track him later on, and extract his retribution. "Oh my poor pawn," Rias murmured in an obvious concern as she looked at his bleeding body. Issei barely held back a snort, amused by her display of concern, as just yesterday, she did nothing to prevent his assassination. "Let's get you cured," said Rias. Issei didn't answer as he felt a pair of soft arms wrapping around before the world disappeared into a crimson flare. When the light subsided, they were back in his room, which surprised Issei a bit. He would have expected her to bring him to a healer instead. But the mystery was resolved when she quickly removed all of her clothing, his clothes subjected to the same treatment a moment later. It took a considerable amount of willpower to keep himself from just pushing her down and teach why it was a bad idea to tease an unfamiliar man. The facade he had been using in the school, the pathetic pervert, was only half fake. He was a pervert indeed, just not pathetic. He was more than capable of seducing a woman or three into his bed whenever he desired. He only stopped it during the last few months to maintain his cover. And, that same fact was making things more difficult under the circumstances. His backed-up desires, multiplied by his transformation, was begging him to take Rias. The soft touch of her skin against his wasn't making control any easier. Her purpose was clear, she was using skin contact to maximize energy transfer. It would not only heal him, but would also speed up the settling of the pawn pieces into his body. A poor replica of the trick Diedrag used. Issei knew that it was a risky procedure for a normal reincarnated piece, carrying a significant risk of side effects. But clearly, Rias was desperate enough to risk it. Luckily, risks hadn't applied to Issei. Diedrag had already used his boosting capabilities to mature his devil body, and Rias' procedure amounted to nothing more than a light snack. He still added it to the list of things he would make her pay, of course. Even better, he decided to start right now. Continuing to act like he was asleep, he brought his hands on Ria's spectacular chest, and his fingers sank into its soft expanse without a warning. Rias tried to jump away, startled, but he hooked his leg, accidentally, preventing her from doing so. With his eyes closed, he wasn't able to see her expression, but the way she stiffened was clue enough. She was considering the merits of teleporting away, but the same desperation that made him target her at the first place prevented her from running away. For her, speeding up his development was too important, not to mention he wasn't fully healed. Her uncomfortable deliberation took almost a minute, but in the end, she uncomfortably settled in his embrace, her skin feeling even hotter to touch, cluing him to the fact that, if he had opened his eyes, he would see a blush deep enough to match her hair. He smirked. The night was shaping to be fun. Chapter 2. Issei was lying on his bed, struggling to suppress his body's natural response for a soft, curvy body that was wrapped tightly around his own. And the fact that it had been months since he had experienced the touch of a woman in an effort to maintain his cover wasn't making things any easier. His instincts were begging him to cut loose, to teach the red-headed beauty a lesson she wouldn't forget. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option. He wasn't even allowed to get an erection because of the slowly closing wound on his stomach. Not because it was a difficult wound. On the contrary, it was trivial, at a point that he needed to actually concentrate to prevent it from healing instantly. But unfortunately, the body of the student Issei wouldn't have reacted like that, leaving him to battle with his own instincts. And it was thoroughly uncomfortable. But at least, it was well worth the reward, keeping his new king unaware. His new king, who was currently in his bed without a stitch of clothing, her body pressing against his as she tried to fill his body with her unholy energies in an attempt to bypass months of slow work, a process that would have risked catastrophic side effects on a regular newly minted devil. Issei was far from regular, of course, but it was the thought that counted. From her perspective, she was risking his life once more just to speed up his progress. There was no way that he was going to let it slide without making her pay. The fact that he wasn't under any real danger thanks to a similar but much more effective treatment from his dragonic partner was immaterial. All it mattered that in her mind, she was risking to transform him into a monster just to get away from a wedding arrangement. Issei had done a lot more for lesser offenses. Still, it was ironic that the ritual she was using gave him an excellent opportunity to punish her. For the quickened maturity ritual, there were 3 requirements. Uninterrupted, skin-to-skin physical contact between parties was the first, to the point that even frilly underwear like Rias seemed to prefer would reduce the chances of success. Secondly, the energies needed to be pure, meaning no active spells on either party, not even a rope spell to keep his hands tied. And 3, it required absolute emotional stability in the part of the recipient, hence the reason to do it in his sleep. Issei buried his head on her breasts in an attempt to hide his smirk, and enjoying the beautiful expanse of her bosom as a spectacular side benefit. She stiffened at the unasked physical contact, but otherwise hadn't reacted, her options neatly blocked by the requirements of her ritual. She wasn't allowed to pull back, and she wasn't allowed to cast a spell to paralyze him. Even trying to push his head away was not an option, as in her mind, it risked waking him up, and she couldn't expect an antisocial pervert not to react hysterically if he found himself in the bed with a sexy redhead. All accounted for one important fact. He had unrestricted access to her body for the next few hours. And he was going to abuse the opportunity to the limit. First few minutes passed without action, with his head buried between her breasts, his breath tickling the soft skin of her breasts. Technically, he could have just let his shaft to jump into life and shoved it inside her, but it was pathetically uninspired. There would be no sense of accomplishment if he took her virginity that cheaply. No, he was going to conquer this arrogant beauty who thought she could dominate him, a dragon. He was going to painstakingly teach her until she understood the real balance of power between them. And as a part of it, he wanted her begging before he took her virginity, the perfect way to underline his domination. It took almost 20 minutes for his wound to close, leaving only an ugly red welt behind, marking the point where he would start for real. First, he shifted around like he was trying to find a more comfortable spot, throwing one of his arms on her waist on the process, the other still around her breast, squeezing occasionally in a movement that might be mistaken for sleep twitching. Rias shuffled a bit, but otherwise didn't react. It seemed that the last few minutes where he spent buried in her breasts had desensitized her against small moves like those. Finally, it was time to stop suppressing his most obvious reaction. With his control loosened, his shaft started to grow. He cracked his eyelid slightly, enough to catch a blurred sight of her face, not wanting to miss that momentous occasion. His shaft continued growing. Soon, it was pressing against her stomach. For a moment, confusion dominated her face, but then, she realized the exact nature of the object that was pressing against her body. Her mouth fell open in shock, looking adorable enough to tempt Issei to catch a kiss. But he held back. Like her virginity, he wanted her first kiss to be surrendered willingly, or at least, taken forcefully in a situation that left no doubt about the power difference between them. Stealing it like a thief had no appeal for him. And it wasn't like he didn't have other things to be amused. His shaft continued to grow, and with it, her expression of shock. He licked his lips as a delicious panic spread on Ria's face while she comprehended the size of the appendage that was currently pressing against her body. He used the opportunity to sink his fingers deeper into her chest, trusting her to miss its significance in her distracted state. Just as he expected, she did miss it, in a way that managed to surprise him even. One of her hands squeezed through the small gap between their bodies, her fingers tracing his shaft from bottom to top, a disbelieving expression on her face, somehow cute and sexy at the same time. And, much to his surprise, she hadn't pulled her hand back after the first round, choosing the reverse its journey instead. Rias continued to repeat the motion, her shock draining with each repeat, replaced with a lusty curiosity. From her hesitancy, he was sure that it was the first time she was seeing a real one. Once again, he didn't do anything else for a few minutes, letting Rias to get used to the changes in the situation. Then, his hand sneaked to her back, his fingers tracing her spine, copying the movement of her fingers. A small yelp of panic escaped her mouth as she noticed the movement along her spine, her own finger stalling in shock. He stopped as well, trying to give the impression that his movement was just an unconscious attempt to copy hers. She came to the same conclusion a moment later, testing it by sliding her finger just a bit, which Issei copied. I shouldn't, she murmured in an attempt to convince herself, however reluctantly. She even managed to follow her own recommendation for a full minute. Without the necessity to keep their bodies connected, she might even succeed in her task. But soon, her curiosity proved stronger than her determination, and her finger was back on Issei's shaft, dancing across its length. He didn't lose any time before replicating her rhythm on her spine, caressing her skin in a slow but steady manner. On the third pass, he decided to spice things up a little, and increased the pressure on her spine, unexpected pressure making her arc her back attractively, which enhanced her generous chest deliciously. He would have liked to use his teeth to pin her flailing breasts in place, but that would have ruined the scheme he put in place. But the temptation wasn't going to be denied completely. When Rias smashed her chest against his in a hurry, trying to maximize the contact once more, he used the opportunity to slide his finger further until his fingertip was resting at the beginning of her bottom. She failed to notice, her attention occupied by creating a mental copy of a particular appendage pressing against her stomach. Slowly, an attractive mixture of mischievous curiosity dominated her face, and the dance of her fingers quickened. For Issei, keeping back a laugh was a real challenge. The situation was comically ironic. There was a red-headed devil in his bed caressing his shaft, completely naked, yet somehow, she was a virgin that lacked even the slightest experience, owing to her overprotective family. And him, the supposed virgin boy that she supposed to taint, was playing her like a fiddle. And to make things even funnier, she was supposed to be his king, his ultimate ruler. Too bad for her, she was going to become his toy in less than a month. A part of him was begging him to start the process right now, turning her to his devoted slave by the dawn, but that was too risky. He didn't think she could act good enough to avoid suspicion, especially from her fellow king, Sona Citri. From there, it would only take a concerned message to one of the Satans, and all of his efforts would have come tumbling down. Issei couldn't help but squeeze her breast hard enough to extract a moan from Ria's lips the moment he remembered Sona, who managed to earn his ire successfully despite their extremely limited contact. The way she talked to him always rubbed him wrong, like he was nothing more than an uppity dog who dared to talk back to royalty. Of course, she was going to get her just desserts. He even knew the best way of penetrating her shell. The same thing she was most proud of. Chess. But tonight was not about Sona. Issei decided as he squeezed Ria's breast once more, trying to maximize the sensation he received from the moment. This time, Rias didn't react other than letting out a small moan, meaning she was starting to write off his molestations as a part of his sleep pattern. Issei had no qualms with abusing the opportunity created by her faulty assumptions. He started squeezing her breasts repeatedly, altering his pressure and rhythm slightly with each repeat to maximize the pleasure. Meanwhile, his other hand, which was caressing her back, quickened its dance along her spine, awakening a tremble across her body. And even more importantly, the dance of her finger over his shaft quickened, following his rhythm perfectly. Pushing forward was tempting, but Issei chose to keep the pace. An hour passed in the same pattern, broken only by occasional adjustments of speed, of which Rias always followed a moment later. She was subconsciously following his rhythm, which was a huge win. Normally, the balance between the pawn and king pieces would have enforced otherwise. A detail a more experienced devil would doubtlessly notice. But Rias was just a young woman, deeply distracted by her own desires and guilt, to notice a detail like that. In other words, perfect virgin sacrifice for the dragon that was named Issei. But as the hour progressed, so did Issei's desires. He decided to push the envelope even further despite the risks. He allowed his hand, which was meticulously caressing her back for the last hour, to slide lower, cupping her plump ass. His fingers sank into her tight flesh, spry enough to bounce a coin. The sudden change of pace caught Rias in surprise, and a moan, louder than the previous ones, escaped her mouth, echoing on the walls. She tried to pull back, but his other hand was ready to prevent it. It held on her shoulder in a steel grip, preventing her from pulling back. He loosened the grip a moment later, enough that she could pull back if she wanted, but the delay was enough for her to remember the necessity of connection. As far as she knew, she needed to maintain the physical connection if she wanted to have a strong pawn, no matter what. If it wasn't for his desire to take her virginity only after she begged him desperately, he would have slid inside her, testing whether her resolution of having a strong pawn was enough to offset the loss of her virginity. With that avenue closed, he needed something else to tease her. Why not jealousy? He decided in a moment of enlightenment. Rias clearly thought herself as the most popular person in the school, an impression that was further reinforced by the abject worship from the student body and her own peerage. And such an impression created a fragile ego, making jealousy the best tool to puncture it, especially in the compromising position they were sharing. But coming up with the best name to arouse her jealousy was the challenge. The humans were automatically out, as despite her attempts to embrace the human culture, Rias was still a devil and didn't treat humans as worthy of her consideration. For devils, even the best of them, ordinary humans were little more than well-trained pets, cute and impressive, maybe, but definitely not worthy of their jealousy. Rias would never take a human name seriously, which only left the devils in the school as a candidate. For a moment, Issei considered Sona, a fellow king of the same social class. If her new pawn was dreaming her rival, she would doubtlessly be annoyed, he thought. Then, he got an even better idea. He didn't lose any time before employing it, because he could sense the energy flow between their bodies slowing down, signifying the closing end to their intimacy. He squeezed her body harder than before, one hand on her breast, the other palming her hips. Her body arched under the sudden rush of feeling, but then, he opened his mouth. "Oh, Akano," he moaned, and just like that, she froze in his arms. It took quite a bit for Issei to keep himself from laughing out loud after seeing her expression, contorted with shock. Of course, he continued pushing. He leaned to capture her nipple between his lips, sucking greedily. That managed to pull her out of her frozen state. She pressed her hand on his shoulder and pushed him back. He chose not to resist, but grabbed her nipple between his teeth at the last second, the resulting pull enough to extract a cry of her. "Oh, Akano-chan, so wild," he murmured, still acting like he was asleep. Filled with a jealous outrage, Rias had pulled her hand back, leaving his shaft bereft of her attention. But their bodies were still connected together as she tried to maintain the spell to enhance his abilities, unaware that it was a complete waste of time. But the energy flow between them suddenly quickened, which would make the procedure riskier than necessary if it had been actually working, but apparently for her, the sting on her pride was more important than the safety of her pawn, her ticket to freedom. Nice to know, Issei noted. Knowing the lengths she would go for her pride would be useful in his journey to break her. But as the procedure neared completion, Issei couldn't help but throw one last dig towards her. "Akano-chan, why do your breasts feel so small? They were supposed to be bigger, and perkier," he added, and was rewarded by a furious gasp, followed by a push that broke the contact between them. Once again, Issei focused not to laugh as Rias jumped out of the bed, gathering her clothes as she mumbled angrily. From the occasional jealous glances he caught, Issei knew that Rias was jealous of Akano's slightly bigger breasts, but he didn't expect her to react badly enough to terminate the process early. Only after the naked figure of Rias disappeared in a shower of crimson light, holding her school uniform against her chest, Issei started laughing. Training his new king was going to be fun. Issei wasn't surprised when Kiba stepped inside the classroom the moment the last bell of the day rang. After all, as far as Rias knew, Issei was still unaware of the supernatural world, chalking up his encounters to bad dreams. He just nodded as Kiba invited him for a talk in the occult club, and followed him without saying a word, ignoring the panic it created in the females of the school, loudly verbalizing their fears about him infecting Kiba with his perversion. Issei didn't pay much attention to them. The other students were nothing more than the background, their only value was to allow him to stay camouflaged. Their opinions worth nothing, especially in a silly topic like that. Soon, they cut through the gardens and stepped inside the occult club, a huge building, especially since it was just a clubhouse. It was smaller than the actual school by a decent margin, but made up the difference by the expensiveness of the decor. Just with a glance, Issei was able to identify many precious relics of underworld, enough to fetch quite a payoff in the black market. However, Issei was in a place that could derive no benefit from material wealth, so he let them be. And more importantly, if he could complete the first leg of his plan, he was going to access more resources than he could imagine. Kiba stood in front of a door which was more ornate than the others and knocked, pulling Issei out of his thoughts. The door opened, revealing the second most popular girl of the school, Akano Himahima on the other side of the door. Thanks, Kiba-kun, she said. Kiba just nodded before walking away. Why don't you come in, Issei-kun? We have a lot to talk about. What exactly? Issei started to say before a sudden stop. He felt his eyes widen in shock. The reason? There was a shower in the middle of the room, surrounded by a curtain that was too thin to hide its insides. And more importantly, the shower was occupied by a familiar figure. He wasn't expecting Rias to be that daring. His genuine shock lasted only for a second, but Issei continued the charade, making a show of stumbling towards the nearest chair, only to miss it, his eyes firmly on the silhouette on the shower curtain while his face twisted into the astonished expression of a perverted virgin. And holding that expression was hard, especially since all he wanted to do was to laugh mockingly as Rias continued her shower behind the insufficient coverage of the curtain. Or more accurately, she swayed under the hot water in a way that reminded him of a stripper. He smiled victoriously. It was clear it was her way of revenge for the last night, teasing him by something that he couldn't actually reach. He couldn't wait to show her just how mistaken she was in that belief. But that was no reason to miss the show that was going in front of him. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching Ria's enchanting sway as she was surrounded by a hot cloud of steam, her assets bouncing freely. From the corner of his eye, he could see Akano watching them with a smile on her lips, but there was a tenseness that she tried to hide. Issei was willing to bet that she wasn't happy with her king debasing herself to impress upon. And he was willing to go forward even more, and betting that Rias didn't explain that she was doing that only because he was murmuring Akano's name in his sleep. Things were going to go even easier than his plans, he realized, if manipulating his new king was that easy. Just a stab to her vanity, a clouded challenge to her self-worth, and she would hurry to counterattack, doing the exact thing Issei wanted her to do. Akano, could you pass the towel, please, Rias said as she turned off the water. Akano didn't neglect to send a sultry, if a bit artificial, smile towards Issei as she stepped behind the curtain, her shadow joining Ria's. But instead of passing the towel to Rias, she started drying her, occasional giggles suggesting ticklishness. Issei had to admit, their plan was simple but effective. It was unfortunate that it was based on faulty information. It would have worked splendidly if he was the simpering weakling he presented himself to be. Then, Rias stepped out of the cover, wearing nothing other than a thin towel, clinging to her body excellently with its slight dampness. But more importantly, on her back, there were a pair of bat wings, proudly on display. Issei-kun, we need to talk, she said, a sly smile adorning her face. Chapter 3 Inches Wow. Rias-senpai, you're so sexy, Issei said with an exaggerated shocked tone which fit his fake persona excellently as he examined Rias, who was wearing nothing but a towel that clung to her body in a way that left little to the imagination, with her wings open proudly behind her. I didn't know you were into cosplay, but you definitely came to the right person to ask for help, he continued excitedly, amused by the way Ria's superior expression slid into disappointment as she failed to get the shock she was clearly aiming for. And it didn't help when Akano giggled in amusement. Issei-kun, Rias answered, trying to hide her disappointment. It's not cosplay. It's not, Issei asked, his voice dejected. So the props are for something boring, like theater. I'll still help, of course, but I would have. He tried to contain until Rias took a step forward and pressed her finger on his lips, her frustration only intensifying as Akano giggled once more, even louder this time. Would you mind? Rias said as she turned her gaze at Akano for a moment. Sorry, Bushu, Akano said in a tone that implied that she wasn't slightest bit sorry. Rias turned back to Issei, doing her best to regain her composure, but it was a difficult task. Clearly, she had been hoping that her combined display with the wings and the revealing state of her body would shock him appropriately, giving her a dominant opening position. It's not cosplay. Issei-kun, she said. They are real. Is this a joke? Issei stammered, trying to put a convincing display. Then, he continued like he was speaking to himself. Or maybe it's another dream. Lately, I had a few dreams where random people sprouted wings and attacked me. Maybe this is one of them. He took a step back, pushing an expression of nervousness on his face. You're not going to attack me as well, right, senpai? He asked with a trembling voice. Trembling, because he was having trouble suppressing his laughter at the frustrated expression on Ria's face. Clearly, fear was not what she was expecting. No, Issei-kun, she said as patient and kind as she could manage. I'm not going to attack you. But maybe you should sit down. What I'm about to tell is going to be hard to handle. He decided to give her a break, and sat on the couch, not that it was a huge sacrifice, especially since Ria sat across him, her short towel riding up to give him a glimpse of her treasure. There is no easy way of saying that, so I'm just going to plow through. We are devils, Ria said, while Akano stood next to her, unleashing her own wings. This time, Issei followed it with more serious questions while acting suitably shocked, and Rias launched a rather long explanation about the supernatural world, about devils, angels, and the battle between three factions. As she explained, Akano took a step back, fading into the background. Or trying to, as it was hard to do for a sexy girl like that, but at least, she tried. I see, Issei murmured after Rias finished her explanation several minutes later. But there is one thing I don't understand. Why are you telling me this? It's about Yuma, Rias said, trying to sound shocked and regretful. Your date with her was not a dream, not even the last part where she started flying and tried to kill you with a spear made of light. Issei noted that as she was explaining the last section, her towel was slowly sliding down, exposing the delicious-looking skin of her breasts bit by bit. Smart, Issei thought. By aligning the most critical part of his supposed origin story with her wardrobe malfunction, she was assuming that a pervert like him wouldn't have asked difficult questions like how Rias was lucky enough to arrive in a window between his death and the deadline for his resurrection. But everyone else claimed that it never happened, Issei countered. How can it be anything other than a dream? A basic memory manipulation spell from the fallen angel was all it took to erase the evidence, she explained. But that's not important. I noticed her presence in my territory too late, and unfortunately, when I arrived, you were already dead. Dead, Issei repeated, trying to sound as shocked as Rias expected him to be. But I'm not dead. I can resurrect the dead as a devil, provided it's just a few minutes after their demise, Rias explained. And I did that to you, she followed. Her towel slid away from her body in that exact moment, giving Issei an unrestricted view of her breasts. Perfectly timed, Issei admitted. If he had been the pathetic pervert he was playing to be, he would have already forgotten the most important parts of the discussion. So, I'm a devil, Issei stammered as he watched Rias wrapping the towel around her chest once more, smug with the way she managed to keep his attention on her body. That would not do, Issei decided, and turned his gaze to slid towards Akano's attractively crossed legs, making sure to be obvious enough to be caught by Rias. Jackpot, he thought when he saw a flash of jealousy on Ria's face. Akano's satisfaction was just a bonus. He knew that Akano's satisfaction was entirely about pulling one over Rias rather than about himself, but he didn't let it bother him. He had a lot of time to change that particular fact. Yes, Issei-kun, Rias answered calmly. You must have noticed some differences in your body, weakness to sunlight, increased strength, keener senses. Like a superhero, Issei cut in. Exactly, Rias added. We're like superheroes. Of course, it's a society with its own rules and requirements, Rias continued, following that with another lengthy explanation of basics of the peerage system, his role, different devil classes, and other peripheral information. Issei reacted with an appropriate level of cheer when Rias revealed that as a devil, he would be allowed to have his own harem once he managed to reach high-class status. She finished her explanation with a breakdown on sacred gears. So, those fallen angels tried to kill me because of my sacred gear, right? Issei said. What does mine can do? We don't know yet, Rias answered, a sliver of worry slivering into her voice despite her struggle to sound calm. Issei knew the reason for her worry. She knew that his sacred gear was a strong one, given that she had to use all of her pawns to actually resurrect him. But not all strong sacred gears had equal combat application, especially when it came to highly restricted events like raiding games. There were some strong gears that could empower the whole armies, but were completely useless in squad level. Is there a way to test? Issei asked, faking enthusiasm. If I have something strong, it would be much easier for me to actually get a harem of my own, he added. Then, he turned to Akano. Maybe I can even steal you for my own harem, Akano-chan, he said with a smirk. Maybe, Akano said with a fake laugh, trying not to seem like she thought him as a cockroach. He couldn't wait to teach her the error of her ways. Anyway, Rias said, cutting Akano off. Issei struggled to suppress his smirk, amused by the ease he could manipulate Rias. It was clear that she was doing her best to use her sexual appeal to tie him to her peerage, but his attention to Akano was starting to sting her pride visibly. We should focus on you trying to conjure your sacred gear. With all those fallen angels around, you need a weapon to protect yourself. But how? Issei said as he raised his arm. Try to focus on your own body. A sacred gear is part of your soul, and it should answer to your need. Issei put a show of struggling for a while, but then sighed in disappointment. It's not working, he said dejectedly. Try again, Issei-kun, Rias insisted. It's very important for your safety. If you have access to it, you can defend yourself even in an ambush, at least for a while before reinforcements can arrive. I'm trying, but it's not working, Issei said after another display of struggle. Maybe we're approaching it from a wrong direction, Akano suddenly said even as she reached for the top button of her shirt, unlocking it with an elegant twist of her fingers. Issei-kun is a devil, and like all devils, he is driven by his sins. She unbuttoned a second one, revealing the beginnings of a cleavage. And I could have a good guess about Issei-kun's sin. What do you think, Bushu? I guess, Rias admitted. Issei sent a questioning look, continuing to play his idiot role. 7 sins, Rias explained. Pride, wrath, gluttony, sloth, greed, envy, and then there is yours, lust, Rias said. Definitely, Issei shouted with an exaggerated display. He was sure that his sin was pride, something that was further exacerbated by Diedrag's effect on his early development, but the primary sin for his alter ego was obviously lust. So, maybe we should give Issei a little push through his passions, Akano whispered seductively as she continued to unlock her buttons, revealing a black, lacy bra that was struggling to hold back her amazing breasts. What do you think, Issei? Akano gasped exaggeratedly. Would you like to sink your fingers on my hot breasts? All it would take is to conjure your sacred gear. And then you can test their softness. Really? Issei said, ignoring the way Rias was discreetly letting her towel to slide down. Rias wasn't happy to be ignored. Rias cut him off immediately. Akano, that's enough. You don't need to put yourself into that position. As a king, it's something I need to do. Issei's smirk went unnoticed as Akano turned towards her king with a shocked expression, failing to understand Ria's overreaction. Despite all the talk about the sins, she failed to realize Rias was being led astray by them, her envy and pride in particular, which was triggered by her perceived loss of last night. Issei understood where her anger was coming from. At this point in her life, one thing Rias wanted more than anything in her life was control over her life, but she didn't have it. Her absolute control over her peerage was the closest she could reach, and she wasn't willing to let it go. Having a peerage member that she didn't control was unacceptable, even if he was controlled by her queen. Issei smirked. If it was that easy to manipulate her, maybe training his new king would be even easier than he first thought. If you wish so, Bushu, Akano said as she buttoned her shirt once more. Rias just nodded, ignoring the worry in Akano's tone. Akano opened her mouth to say anything else, but Rias just shook her head, sending a warning glare towards Akano. It was a harsher one than the situation deserved, and Akano looked a bit hurt, but still followed her king's command, and left the room. So, Rias-senpai, Issei started, but Rias cut him off. Please call me Bushu, she said, but as Issei's attention turned towards her cleavage, a blush spread through her face, as if it was only occurring to her that what she had committed for. Clearly, it was a rash decision she regretted, but with Akano already out, there was little she could do to change. Even declaring that she changed her mind was not an option for her, as she was in a hurry to convince Issei about her trustworthiness, and changing her mind that easily would work against that aim. She raised her hand, and a ray of red energy reached for the door, locking it with a distinct click. While she couldn't avoid it, she could at least ensure that there would be no observers. Let's move on the couch, Rias said, pointing towards the rather bulky seat on the corner of the room. Issei took a seat on the couch, deliberately seating closer to the middle to force Rias to stay closer. How are we going to do it? Issei asked. Should I just? He said before reaching forward, deliberately leaving the sentence dangling, but the grabbing motion with his hand was enough to fill the blanks. I guess, Rias murmured, for once her haughtiness nowhere to be seen. Issei understood the reason perfectly. His earlier research showed that, for all her bluster, she was a complete novice when it came to touch of a male. From her reaction, it might be that her experience might be limited to blind fumbles of the last night. And since she didn't know about his trick, from her perspective, it was the first time a man was about to touch her consciously, and to make things even worse, he was directly going for the second base. Oh pie, Issei murmured, doing his best to look overwhelmed by the opportunity. He made sure that the smile that appeared on his face as he leaned forward was more perverted than victorious. He gently put his hand under her breasts, the area that was still covered by her towel, then closed his eyes. It helps, he murmured. I can sense something in my right arm, something strong, something potent. As he spoke, he sank his fingers to her breasts, the thin towel barely putting a barrier in between. Very good, Issei-kun, Rias said. Issei examined her expression discreetly. She tried to seem enthusiastic, but her acting abilities weren't good enough to erase her distaste completely. Now, try to bring that feeling forward. I'm trying, but it's tough. The sensation is slipping away. He opened his eyes and stopped squeezing for a moment, giving the impression of deep thought. Maybe this would help, he said with obvious excitement, and pulled Ria's towel down. It pulled on her waist, leaving her chest bereft of protection. She gasped as his fingers sank into her flesh once more, this time without her towel to reduce the impact. She was shocked by his daring, but from her expression, he could see that she was about to push him away, but he exactly knew how to prevent it. It's working, Rias murmured in disbelief, her eyes focused on Issei's right arm, which was bathed with a crimson shine, creating the silhouette of a gauntlet. Not one to miss such an opportunity, Issei started squeezing her peaks harder. A few seconds, she let it be, and when she opened her mouth to complain, he intensified the light on his arm, giving her another evidence that it was working excellently. Then, he grabbed her nipple with his shining hand, and twisted, forcing a gasp from her. Issei, she started to say, but he chose that point to materialize his sacred gear, and her words died on her lips. That's my sacred gear, Issei murmured as he squeezed her nipple between his metal-clad fingers. Neat. It still has the sensation of touch. A twice critical, Rias murmured in shock, examining Issei's arm, which was covered with the sealed version of the boosted gear. I don't understand, how can it be a twice critical? It took all of my pawns. Issei didn't want her to slide into despair, so he cut her off. Bushu, I don't know how, but I can still feel that something is locked in my arm. Something vast and angry. It's hard to describe, but I'm convinced that it's only a small part of its full potential. A sealed form, of course, Rias answered, her shock replaced with excitement. Of course, she repeated as she jumped on her feet in excitement, her impressive tits tangling attractively. Even better. Her towel slid down even further, revealing her womanhood to Issei's gaze. Nice, Issei moaned in a faux shock. Rias yelped in shock as she tried to reach for the towel, realizing that, in her excitement, she accidentally provided a true feast for his eyes. Issei let his gauntlet to shine once more, suggesting that seeing her naked was helping him to break through the lock. Rias pulled the towel on in a hurry, and the glow stopped, but he left the twice critical out, mostly to convince Rias that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. With physical evidence of her success, she would be more easily convinced for future experimentation. I think that's enough for today, Rias stammered as she clutched on her towel. It seemed that her accidental flashing him was far above her limits. I think it's better if you dispel your sacred gear for today. It's better if we take it slowly, without overwhelming you. You know the best, Bushu, Issei answered as he turned eyes to his gauntlet. A moment of intense concentration later, the gauntlet melted back into his arm, leaving his arm bare. Then, he raised his hands, and wiggled his fingers suggestively, a lecherous smile on his lips. But I'm always up for more experimentation if you're willing to. Try to summon your sacred gear, she asked. He closed his eyes, trying to give an impression of intense focus, but pulled only a few sparks. It's easier than before, but it's still hard, like there is a barrier I can't push through. He turned his eyes to her towel-covered bosom pointedly. Rias didn't say anything for a moment, but Issei continued to look. Okay, she said with a sigh as she let her towel to fall to her waist, her exasperation suggesting that she saw no harm in giving another view of her amazing breasts, but she still kept her womanhood hidden. How about this, Issei-kun? She gasped in a flirty tone. Is this working for you? It's working. Rias-chan, Issei answered as he devoured her sexy body with his eyes, intentionally using her name rather than the title she asked him to use. And a few seconds later, the twice critical was in his arm. Huh, that was much easier, he added. Practice makes it perfect, Issei-kun, Rias said as she reached for her towel once more, but her measured words contrasted with her spreading blush. But I think we should call it a day. It has been a tough day for you, with a lot of developments. Tomorrow, you can start working on your contracts. Whatever you wish. Bushu. Issei answered cheerfully. But what should I do if I run into one of these fallen angels? He asked. She nibbled her lips as she considered his words. Good point, there is no guarantee that they won't target you. Maybe you should just stay there. It shouldn't be hard since you live alone. I'll send my familiars to pick your personal items. Rias said. According to the cover he was using, he was an orphan, though, in actuality, he had deposited his parents in a safe location in Australia years ago, with a dash of memory manipulation and a buttload of defensive spells to make it stick. He wasn't the poster boy when it came to familial duties, but even he acknowledged that having a family bustling around when he was one slip up away from the most wanted man in the supernatural world. For a moment, he considered whether to play insulted orphan thing, but then decided against. It might have made sense if he was masquerading as a strong but mysterious boy. In that case, acting like an asshole would only add to his attractiveness, but in his current role, it wouldn't help any. Tell them to be careful about my games. They're very precious, Issei said. I'll do so. For now, you can use the room at the end of the corridor, Rias said, relaxed that her offer accepted quickly. Now, why don't you go and see your new room while I change? As you wish, Bushu, he murmured as he walked away. Rias waved her hand and removed the magical lock from the door, and Issei stepped into the corridor. Another transparent ploy from her, Issei thought derisively as he searched for his new room. By making him move out of his house and into her domain for security reasons, she linked him to her logistically without turning it into a confrontation. And it gave her the chance to shower him with luxuries, he added as he stepped in his new room, lavishly decorated, and a huge, four-poster bed in the middle of the room. Issei couldn't wait to break Rias on that exact bed. That's where we stop. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day and bye.